Sang asked about his chances. June said he didn't know. When heart and mind fight, mind doesn't always win. He decided to treat inheritance as a bonus. June then spoke of the remaining $2.2 billion. He planned to exchange them at peak rates after elections and invest in a media city. Sahan protested, but June calmly explained infrastructure, broadcasting, employment, and political value. An investor pouring $2.2 billion into media during a crisis would be welcomed with open arms. Sahan laughed and asked if June was his grandfather's clone. June smiled lightly and replied that he was simply a respectful grandson. The man frowned and asked what other kind of respect June was talking about. June thought of his father and answered calmly that he would turn SMC into a massive media empire and hand it over to him. San rose from his chair, fists clenched, clearly wanting to say something, but he stopped himself. June stood as well and continued without hesitation, listing cinema, broadcasting, content production, cable networks, and internet media. He said that in the future all of it would be connected. June added that his father was also the chairman's son, so giving him an equivalent share was necessary to preserve face. San's eyes widened in shock. June grew more serious and explained that Fantasy's American branch already had deep ties with major film companies. Looking out the window, he said that if done correctly, a global media company could be born. Yang Chao sat silently, rereading the contract. His expression darkened slightly before he finally set it aside and admitted that June had managed to secure everything in the end. June smirked faintly and said that with this contract, even if his uncle became mayor, he would never be able to disobey his grandfather. Once it was made public, any resistance would end with charges under the Political Funds Act and total political ruin. Yang Chao removed his glasses and said all he truly needed was a few acres of land, and replied that he could take the rest for himself. He remarked that during the contract signing, his aunt had shown remarkable insight. Yang Chao immediately understood. She had realized the value of state-owned land and made it clear that June should not even dream of taking all of it in exchange for election funding. Yang Chao smiled and told him to take everything and give it to his grandson. June grinned inwardly, realizing he had just received implicit permission. He raised both hands and said calmly that making money through apartment construction was not his style. Yang Chao rubbed his chin and warned that this entire plan was reckless, since there was no guarantee his uncle would even win the election. June replied confidently that thinking positively already increased his odds. Yang Chao chuckled and admitted he couldn't keep up with his grandson's thinking. June smiled, feeling a trace of pity for whoever would run against his uncle, knowing the Sang group had already ordered a full excavation of the opponent's past. Yang Chao folded his arms and said that since June had spent so much money placing the sole mayor directly into his hands, he could not stay uninvolved. During the election, he would help as well. June bowed in thanks, though he quietly reflected on how shameless it was for his grandfather to phrase it that way, as if it hadn't been June's money in the first place. Yang Chao noticed the disappointment and reassured him, saying he would give him another gift. If there was anything he wanted, he should speak now. June hesitated, then said he was considering starting a new business, but would explain after the election. Yang Chao warned him that any business requiring government involvement was bound to be dangerous. Politics added countless variables, and politicians never helped without demanding something in return. June grew tense, unsure whether this was advice or a warning. He stood and promised that once the plan was complete, he would consult his grandfather first and stop immediately if told to do so. Yang Chao smiled, satisfied. He told June it was his money and his business, that he didn't need permission, and even failure would be valuable experience. On the morning of December 19th, news spread everywhere that Kim Dong of the Second National Assembly had been elected president. Inside a cafe, June sat with his classmates, laughing and talking. One of them teased him, asking if he had forgotten his promise to pass exams without restrictions. June smiled and said he remembered everything. They joked that as a third-generation chaebol, he must never come to places like this. June only grinned. In truth, He had been to places like this countless times, even ordering alcohol without snacks when money was tight. He raised his hand and decided to give his friends the meal he once wanted but couldn't afford. He ordered bottled beer. The waitress and his classmates stared in shock. June smiled and added that since he hadn't drunk in a long time, he would do it properly. A friend suddenly shouted across the restaurant that June was buying drinks. Ignoring the noise, June ordered appetizers, then fried chicken at his friend's insistence. His classmates asked if he often visited places like this. June answered honestly, saying he ate kebabs at train stations with family and stews with his uncles. He asked if they really thought chaebol families only ate in luxury hotels every day. At home, he said, they ate ordinary soup and rice, nothing special. Remembering his past, June realized how easy it was to blend in now and decided to wash away the image of a privileged heir. A group of fourth-year students approached their table. One of them apologized and asked to speak. They explained that companies were refusing to hire new employees. June listened quietly as they asked what would happen next, whether they should switch to studying for exams like the bar. June hesitated. Telling the truth would crush them, but lying would be worse. He took a sip of his drink and finally spoke. He told them to quit their current plans and study for exams. Shock rippled through the table. He explained calmly that recruitment would stop, mass layoffs would begin, and corporations would fire at least 30% of their workforce under the excuse of restructuring. The IMF crisis was not just a liquidity issue. It was systemic collapse. He said the concept of lifetime employment would disappear. Freelance labor would replace stable jobs. When they asked what a freelancer was, June pointed at the waitress and asked what would happen if her boss told her to quit tomorrow. She would leave immediately, with no protection. He explained that this model would spread to even large corporations. Silence followed. June said recovery would take years, and unless they were studying for exams, joining the army might be the only option. His classmates didn't fully grasp it yet. But June knew that next year, many of them would sit on benches in despair, finally understanding what his words meant. The fourth-year student turned to Jun and thanked him sincerely. The man with glasses offered only a faint smile in Jun's direction. Jun looked at him and calmly explained that he had merely described the worst possible scenario because the people around him were the ones who ran companies, and they always prepared for the worst case first. The fourth-year student lifted his glass of beer and said that they should also prepare for the worst, since graduation was already right in front of them. The man with glasses apologized for ruining the mood and offered Jun a drink. Suddenly, he raised his glass high and shouted to everyone in the establishment that they still had time, enough time to save themselves from the crisis, so there was no need to worry and they should drink properly while they could. Smiles spread across the room. Even if some of them were forced, the atmosphere lightened. People began chatting loudly, clinking glasses, some standing to make playful toasts. Jun smiled quietly as he drank. Then the door opened. Someone approached their table. A shadow stretched across the floor as the person walked closer. Jun looked up, puzzled. A girl wrapped in warm clothes stood in front of him. He kept his face expressionless, but inside he felt a flash of panic as he struggled to remember her name. The girl pointed sharply at him and asked if he had already forgotten it. Jun admitted it honestly. A slightly drunk fourth-year student asked why she was there. Jun's eyes widened as her name finally came back to him. Minin. Minin smiled faintly and sat down. As she loosened her coat, she asked for only half a glass since she needed to return to the library afterward. Jun stared at her. A fourth-year student asked with open hostility whether she even studied during the holidays and why she had time to sit there. Minin answered calmly that preparing for the state exam took 2 years, and people had the right to decide how to spend their own time. Jun lowered his glass, sensing something deeper behind her words. Minin suddenly called everyone funny and asked if they had come here to ask Jun about the state of enterprises and how long the crisis would last. Everyone froze. The man with glasses realized in that moment that Minin understood the world far better than she let on. Minin downed her drink in one gulp and said that even Seoul University graduates were already crying because once they left campus, life became brutal. At least law students still had exams to rely on. Jun frowned slightly. Someone asked Minin if she and Jun discussed economic issues during the day. One of Jun's classmates shouted in denial, then panicked and asked Minin to confirm that Jun hated people proud of strength or money. He pointed at Jun, saying he had both. The table erupted in laughter. Jun closed his eyes briefly. He didn't envy them. As someone who had lived a far longer life internally, desire rarely ruled him anymore. Minin stood up, put her coat back on, and said goodbye. As she passed Jun, she asked him to come outside. She said she had something to ask. Outside, the cold air bit into Jun's skin. Minin hesitated, embarrassed, then confessed that passing the state exam before graduation was her duty. She explained the pressure her family placed on her. Finally, she stepped closer and said quietly that she didn't have time to date him. Jun stared in confusion. Minin scolded him for reacting so weakly. When he asked if she didn't hate people proud of money and power, she answered simply that he was handsome. Then she added that even if they were busy, they could meet for lunch once or twice a month. Jun finally understood. She was asking him out. He smiled. Minin clenched her fist in victory. Jun told her to call him and he would send a car. Then he warned that they couldn't date like ordinary people. Minin stared in shock. Jun waved goodbye and returned inside. His classmates immediately demanded answers. He lied casually, saying it was about a group assignment. Moments later, Minin burst back in and shouted that from today, she and Jun were dating. The first years were horrified. The fourth years laughed. Jun realized there was no escaping it now. The scene shifted to the family mansion. Yangchao's daughter and her husband stood nervously as he listed their assets. He scolded his daughter for having less than her sisters. She snapped that this was why she entered politics, to compensate for power. Yangchao sighed deeply. Her husband boasted about his political future, causing Yangchao to nearly laugh at the irony. Yangchao called people into the office. 5 sat across from the couple. He announced that from today onward they would support his son-in-law's campaign. The man bowed deeply, thanking him. Yangchao handed over folders. One contained future deputy mayor candidates. Another listed influential organization heads. Promises were already written. The son-in-law realized in horror that Sang Group would effectively rule Seoul. He felt like a puppet but endured silently, vowing to counterattack once he had power. The scene shifted again. Jun and Sean arrived at a Lion Company branch. They were greeted warmly. Liang stepped forward, extending her hand. Sean shook it politely, thanking her for coming. Liang pointed toward the chairs and told Xian to sit, reminding him that the man who saved Aji Group was owed repayment. Byun stood quietly to the side, watching the exchange, his expression turning serious as he recalled a recent conversation with his grandfather. The chairman remarked that Li Jiang's career was impressive, but what truly surprised the protagonist was learning that Liang was a graduate of the 16th class of the military academy, had worked in the Central Bureau during the Fifth Republic, and had even been a member of the Changman Party. Jae-cho glanced at his grandson and explained that in the early days, Li Jiang had been indispensable to Changman, much like the head of the Secretariat, because of his exceptional capabilities. June flinched slightly when Liang asked Xian who he was. San, seated next to Liang, calmly introduced him as his employee, explaining that there were no secrets between them since everything discussed would eventually be shared anyway. Jun bowed politely to Liang, who smiled and reassured San not to worry, saying he had nothing to hide. As the three of them settled onto the couches, Liang asked Xian directly whether Fantasy Investments planned to transfer $2.2 billion of available capital from its New York headquarters to Korea. After receiving confirmation, Liang asked if there were any conditions. Xian replied that he simply wanted to discuss everything in person. Liang's attention shifted to the folder handed to him, which contained a detailed plan to establish an SMC within a media group. He stared at it silently. Jun frowned slightly, realizing that Liang showed no surprise at the massive figure of $2.2 billion. Watching Li Jiang remain calm, Jun wondered whether the man truly understood the value of money. Only when Liang glanced at San did his lips tremble faintly as he asked why an investor would pursue this, nodding that finance and construction were not exactly compatible fields. San answered calmly that the business plan went far beyond construction, which was only one component, and that the project was structured as an independent enterprise. He encouraged Liang to consider the situation from a positive perspective. Liang grinned and asked whether San truly considered a massive injection of foreign dollars into Korea a positive thing. San acknowledged the concern, and Liang reminded them that even if Korea benefited initially, the money would eventually return to the United States. The chairman glanced at Jun, who calmly responded that it would actually be the opposite. Introducing representatives of various companies, Jun explained that their firm specialized in transferring money earned in the United States back into Korea, generating massive profits through reinvestment. With those profits, they had even acquired Aji Group. Looking straight at Li Zhang, Jun referred to the entire process as pioneer of export. Liang frowned, confused by the term, but then smiled when Jun clarified that he was simply playing with words. Turning to Liang, the protagonist explained that export was any activity that brought in foreign currency, and even if they did not sell physical goods, they were still earning dollars. After listening carefully, Liang admitted that while it looked that way now, the future could be different. Xian added that if profit alone were the goal, they would not have absorbed losses from double currency conversion, since it would be extremely difficult to extract double profits from the proposed plan. He urged the chairman to review the folder at least once. Liang hesitated, then finally picked it up. As he read through the documents, it became clear that for him, the word exporter symbolized power and national pride. Exports were what had transformed Korea from one of the poorest nations into an economic powerhouse. From childhood, Koreans had grown up watching ships loaded with resources, knowing their country lacked them. That was why Liang felt uncomfortable hearing a term so deeply tied to national pride spoken casually by someone who only dealt in money. Placing the folder on the table, Liang summarized the plan as an attempt to create a mecca for Korea's media industry. With a slight smile, he asked Xian whether they planned to invest the full $2.2 billion into media. Xian replied that media was only one area, explaining that they intended to invest across multiple sectors and act as managing partners in Korea, while gradually transitioning control to local investors. Liang folded his hands and thought deeply before asking what industry San had decided on. San hesitated, clearly nervous, while Jun noticed his uncle's shock. Liang praised Xian's intellect, which only made him more flustered. Seeing this, the protagonist smiled slightly, remembering a meeting with new millennium entrepreneurs, where the government had pushed hard to support venture capital as a way to stimulate the economy. He also recalled discussions about cultural enrichment, realizing that removing the American investment label from fantasy investments would align perfectly with current government priorities. Listening carefully, Li Zhang nodded as Jun explained that this sector would significantly support small and medium-sized businesses. He gestured confidently, saying that if government policy shifted in this direction, the results would be outstanding. Liang expressed strong agreement, clearly pleased. Jun noted internally that politicians only wanted to hear answers that matched their own desires, and what Li Zhang wanted most was a vision of a strong future. Liang then asked Xian whether he was considering investing directly in this sector, but Jun suddenly intervened, stating that their company had no such intention. The statement shocked both Xian and Liang. Liang frowned, irritation surfacing, but Jun calmly explained that the industry should grow through new technologies alone. If private capital interfered too early, innovation would be flattened, and young ventures would be restrained by outdated capitalism. Surprised, Liang asked whether that meant turning the industry into a state-run entity. Jun replied calmly that the government should focus on infrastructure and let entrepreneurs emerge naturally, which would ultimately bring greater profits. Liang grew thoughtful, clearly weighing the argument. Silence fell as he considered the words. Finally, he said that Jun's opinion was interesting. Lowering his hand, he announced that the plan would be carefully reviewed and that they would be contacted later. In the meantime, he asked them to explain the broader investment strategy. San stared in disbelief. Even Jun was shocked, knowing that such words from the selection committee chairman were effectively approval. After a moment, Liang extended his hand and shook Xian. Byun watched with a faint smile, noticing that the chairman did not offer his hand to him, a subtle reminder of hierarchy. Jun felt a brief sting of disappointment but understood the message. Minutes later, Jun and San walked down the street, both smiling. San asked whether Jun was interested in investments. When he disagreed, San demanded to know why he seemed so dismissive of a highly profitable industry. Jun replied bluntly that they now owned a company competing for championships with Daewoo Motors and had no place among venture firms struggling for incremental gains. San bristled, arguing that once such companies grew, they could not be ignored. Jun countered calmly, stating that their Sang branch alone had earned over 2 trillion 1 year earlier, a level most ventures would never reach. San snapped that Jun needed to understand the value of every penny. Smiling, Jun replied that San was free to invest wherever he wished and earn some pocket money. San fell silent, frowning deeply. Unaware, Jun thought about smaller firms that had yet to grow, including Windy City from Next Sun, which had launched only last year. Suddenly, San stopped him, shouting not to make a mistake. Startled, Jun asked what he meant. San erupted in anger, saying that possessing hundreds of billions did not make one a conglomerate chairman. His teeth clenched as he explained that real chairmen commanded tens of thousands of laborers whose small earnings built empires. It was with those pennies that his grandfather had bought a steel mill in China. Jun listened in shock as San continued, saying that without those workers there would be no chairman. Through clenched teeth, San accused Jun of acting like a chaebol without ever being a laborer himself. The words hit hard. Jun lowered his head, remembering his past life, realizing that for the first time in 10 years San was right. He had grown arrogant. His lips trembled as he bowed and asked for forgiveness. Surprised by the sudden change, San waved it off, saying nothing serious had happened and that realizing it quickly was what mattered. As they continued walking, San again suggested discussing future investments. Jun proposed online games, suggesting 1 billion won each in 2 companies. San rubbed his jaw, then countered with 10 billion total, nomming 2 games and letting Jun choose the rest, spreading smaller amounts across multiple ventures. He smiled and reminded Jun that the government was preparing to support the IT sector. Jun smiled back, regretting that this capable man would retire in 5 years. Winter of 1997 arrived. The streets grew cold, and for the first time, Christmas music was absent. Inside a quiet office, influential figures gathered, discussing matters softly while Jun and San observed. One man asked whether they should begin the takeover process now that merger talks with Sang were complete. San replied calmly that the agreement was not yet signed and that share adjustments were still underway. Another asked when it would finish. San said that question should be directed to Sang. As the discussion continued, Jun suddenly interrupted, saying that was not all. The men looked at him in confusion. When asked who he was, Jun bowed as San introduced him as someone summoned from the U.S. headquarters to oversee the merger and acquisition. The room fell silent. 3 men stood, offering their business cards. Jun realized they were measuring his status. When they read his card, confusion spread. Jun apologized for using an English name, explaining that as a second-generation Korean born in the U.S., he was registered as Howard Jin. Whispers followed, unease settling in as they grasped his authority. Folding his hands, Jun explained that their investment analysis team was double-checking the acquisition. One man protested, asking why. San closed his eyes, saying nothing. Jun grinned, explaining that even now, the bank adhered strictly to its systems, ignoring hierarchy. San admitted he had tried to intervene, but procedures ruled everything. Jun added that this rigidity was precisely why the system was powerful. He then laid out the original scenario. Sang had planned to acquire Agimotors but exhausted its capital buying Hando Steel. That was when they approached Fantasy. The plan was to hold Agimotors until Sang raised funds, then sell it at a premium. The room went silent. Jun struck the table, stating that during the currency crisis, the purchase price had been 1.2 trillion won at an exchange rate of 800 to $1. Now the rate was 1,800, reducing the value to around $670 million. If it rose to 2,500, it would drop even further. The men panicked, arguing that the IMF had already injected $2 billion. Jun cut them off, reminding them that 55.5 billion had been promised, but only 2 had arrived, and that a change in power would force renegotiations. The room fell silent once again. The protagonist frowned slightly and told the man that the promised money would never arrive. The statement shocked the head of the company. One representative adjusted his glasses without speaking. Another coughed into his fist and avoided eye contact. Dodden placed his hands calmly on the armrests and said plainly that if they wanted to survive, you need fantasy money by the end of the year. He continued, explaining that the new government would soon begin consolidating banks. Exporting companies earned dollars, importing companies needed them, and whoever controlled the right currency would control the market. Sean glanced at Jun as he added that the Korean market was unstable, and the real question was whether the economy would rise again or collapse completely. Silence swallowed the room. The man with glasses finally asked what Jun was trying to say. The protagonist stared at him for a moment, then said calmly that although their company held first priority acquisition rights, they intended to give them up. Shock rippled across the room. The head of the company froze. Another man's mouth fell open. The man with glasses nearly shouted, demanding to know what Jun was talking about. Jun clasped his fingers together and said that keeping those rights would mean ruin. As the men jumped to their feet, he asked them calmly whether the U-Group would intervene if Fantasy stepped aside from acquiring Agimotors. The room fell into stunned silence. Everyone understood that Hyun would not involve. Sean closed his eyes, not daring to interfere. Jun smiled faintly, knowing that now everyone would rush to settle matters as quickly as possible. The scene shifted to Yanchel's office, where the old man openly admired Jun's decision. With a slight smile, Yell said that it was Dodden's words and actions that forced everyone to make a choice. Jun remained silent, remembering how he had announced the purchase price directly to the company's representatives. One of them had shouted angrily that it was only 60% of the original valuation. Jun had not argued. He had simply closed his eyes and said that if they agreed, $400 million would be deposited into their account that very day. They had gone silent instantly. Yell smiled, praising his grandson for not giving them time to think. He said that if Jun had allowed hesitation, they would have found a way out. Jun shrugged, saying it would not work next year. The old man grinned and asked whether he should drive the wedge deeper to force acceptance. Jun nodded, asking him to prepare Sang's consultant position, promising to cover all expenses. Yell laughed, saying his grandson was learning bad habits. Jun smiled inwardly, knowing exactly who he had learned them from. Soon after, Yell handed Jun an envelope. Inside was a list of banks scheduled to be sold and merged. Jun froze in shock. The old man said calmly that he had been wondering how to use this information, but now it clearly belonged to his grandson. When Jun asked whether the banks knew, Yell replied with a wide smile that only the U-Group was aware. Jun was horrified but quickly said he could use it effectively. Yell leaned back, remarking that Jun was simply lucky. He added that once those banks realized they were about to be discarded, they would beg and soon enough bow in gratitude. Jun studied the list with regret, thinking that if he had known earlier, negotiations could have started at 50% instead of 60. Yell then mentioned that Sang planned to announce large-scale reconstruction early next year. Jun understood instantly that managing $1 billion was not easy for everyone. He called the decision difficult, but Yell replied that he was tired of uncompetitive branches draining money. The old man smiled again, relieved that he would not have to listen to complaints about unfair dismissals. Jun shuddered, remembering how companies that survived the IMF crisis gained dominance and how monopolization followed. Yell stood, saying it was time to act on plans he had delayed for years. He told his grandson it was his 20th birthday present. Confused, Jun listened as Yell explained that he would receive shares in the company through the restructuring plan, allowing him to acquire them cheaply. Jun shouted in disbelief. The old man laughed, amused that someone who had taken over Suy and G Motors was thrilled by a few extra shares. That evening, Sang contacted Fantasy's New York office, and $400 million were transferred to the creditor's account. The next morning, lawyers reviewed the revised Agi Group acquisition agreement at the bank's headquarters. By afternoon, the deal was signed. January 1, 1998 arrived at the Jun family estate. Chandeliers glowed in celebration. Guests chatted freely while the protagonist's family stood at the center. Sangjun stiffened when his grandfather asked whether he was studying music. Bowing politely with a glass in hand, Sangjun explained that he was involved in producing music albums. The old man smiled, saying he already knew everything, then asked whether he was too old to understand such things. Sangjun hesitated, then admitted he had changed his major. The grandfather encouraged him to succeed in what he loved. Next, Yell told Sangjun to learn from his father, then turned to Yoongi, asking whether he truly ran the largest film company in Korea. Yoongi denied it modestly, but Yell interrupted, saying that in 10 years he had built a company comparable to the largest. Yoongi replied confidently that next year they would be among the very top. The room froze. The protagonist's mother was stunned. Jun simply smiled. Turning back to Sangjun, the grandfather warned him not to waste time and to finish his studies quickly so he could be the best in his field within 10 years. Sangjun clenched his fist, then bowed deeply, swearing to become the best. Jun smiled quietly as he sipped his drink. Later, while at home, Jun saw the first news of the year. 2 banks were being sold, one a former savings bank, the other a regional bank that had grown nationally. Both were listed for foreign sale. Public outrage exploded and gratitude toward the IMF vanished. Jun realized the IMF aid had come with conditions. What shocked him most was that this event had never occurred in his past life. He flipped through his notebook repeatedly, unable to find any record of it. Despair hit him. If he had known earlier, could he have bought a bank himself? He clenched his fists. Having such information was like having wings. The joy of owning a major automobile company only days earlier vanished. His anger sharpened, and he set a single goal in his mind. Soon, reporters crowded the entrance of the Jun family mansion as a massive motorcade arrived. Guests praised the daughter-in-law for the invitation. She smiled, explaining that she would live with her husband's family in the main estate. Friends joked that Chaebol still lived like the Joseon era. She replied calmly that even if offered another home, she would refuse, because a princess could not leave her kingdom. Laughing softly, she said her only duty was to smile sweetly at breakfast and dinner, calling it worth it. Elsewhere at a remote estate, Yonan's friends joked about his married life. One suggested nothing would change. Yonan sighed, cigarette in hand, saying his father now demanded he take the company seriously. Stubbing out the cigarette, he smiled and said that while they ignored their wives, they also ignored the old men. As he turned to leave, he pulled aside a bearded friend and ordered him to put the supporting actress on a plane in 2 days, book her a room, and call him. The friend stared in disbelief. Yonan patted his shoulder and walked away, muttering that he had no idea what to do for 10 days with a wife he barely knew. The man waved his hand at Yonan and told him to just consider it a wedding gift. The scene returned to the banquet hall. Guests bowed one after another, congratulating the chairman. Some stepped forward to shake Yanchel's hand, showing their respect. The daughter-in-law's father extended his hand, praising the reception hall as perfect for a modest wedding ceremony. Yanchel shook hands with the matchmaker and calmly said that his daughter would never have to worry about anything in their household. Without warning, Yanchel tightened his grip, still smiling, and invited the matchmaker aside to discuss something privately. The man agreed without losing his smile. Soon, they entered a secluded room and sat facing each other, tea placed neatly on the table between them. Yanchel frowned and told Hong to stop, reminding him that he was now part of their family. Hong looked startled and asked what he meant. Veins bulged on the old man's neck as he suggested that, for the sake of their children, everything from the past should be forgotten. Hong was shaken by those words. Yanchel closed his eyes briefly, saying that although he understood the desire to investigate one's in-laws, that curiosity needed to end here. Hong grew anxious and tried to explain himself, but the old man sharply ordered him to stay quiet and listen. Fear crept over Hong as Yanchel spoke in a low, angry voice. He said that Yonan was not very bright, that even at 30 he still loved to play around, and that although he did not know what Hong's family had been plotting, it would stop now. Hong tried to interrupt, insisting it was a misunderstanding, but the old man cut him off, saying that Yanjun would be fine because he was his grandson. Hong lowered his head, saying nothing. Yanchel continued coldly, saying it did not matter what mistakes his grandson made in life because he was family. Hong's hands trembled with suppressed anger. The old man warned him never to invite his son-in-law again, declaring that he would not maintain contact with his wife's relatives. If Hong wished to see his granddaughter, he was to call her directly. His voice darkened as he said that today would be the last day Yonan ever saw their side of the family. Hong's face drained of color, but Yanchel continued, declaring that anyone with the surname Hong should never even think of entering a building bearing his family name. Rising from his seat, the old man warned that if his words were ignored, Hong's company would be destroyed completely. Sweat poured down Hong's face. Yanchel walked past him without another glance, telling him not to take this lightly. Hong stood frozen, as if struck by lightning, understanding that Yanchel viewed Yonan as a successor and protected him fiercely. Adjusting his glasses, Hong told himself grimly that he did not have much time left. Soon after, the newlyweds emerged to greet the guests. Hong clenched his fist, realizing the young couple had a bright future ahead. Grinding his teeth, he reminded himself that time was not on the chairman's side. Night fell. Yoongi sat in his father's office and leaned forward slightly, asking if there was something he wanted to discuss. Yanchel smiled and asked how his business was doing. Yoongi replied calmly that his industry was the least affected by the currency crisis. His father asked whether attracting investors to cinema had become difficult. Yoongi said that it was not a reason to despair, since others were struggling even more. Yanchel smiled, then surprised his son by asking for his help. Yoongi laughed, saying he was not young enough to be tricked so easily. His father smirked, and after a pause, told him that he would hand over the Saying Medical Foundation and its development center. Yoongi stared in shock. Hospitals like those under the foundation could be counted on one hand, and the land alone cost a fortune. The development center, though independent, served as a training ground for interns, managers, and leadership programs. Yanchel asked if that was not enough. Yoongi hesitated, realizing something deeper was bothering him. It was about his son, D-Jun. After clenching his leg, Yoongi suddenly shouted that it was not enough. The two stared at each other in silence. Yanchel asked calmly where such greed came from. Yoongi replied that he was doing his duty as a father. When asked if he meant D-Jun, Yoongi answered yes. The chairman leaned back, arms crossed, and said that D-Jun would understand, being smarter than his father. He instructed Yoongi to safeguard what he was given and pass it on later, while he himself would handle D-Jun separately, as cheaply as possible. Yoongi stared, stunned, asking whether his father planned to take money from his grandson. Yanchel sighed heavily, saying D-Jun would understand everything. Later, aboard a plane above the clouds, Yonan and his wife sat in business class. She looked around and asked if it was a charter. Yonan smiled and said he had bought all of first class for them and all of business class for their entourage. She wondered if this was the life of a chaebol. She then pulled out a folder of documents and handed it to him. Inside were detailed dossiers on every member of his family, including photographs. Yonan's face twisted in anger. When he realized she had been monitoring Di-jun closely, rage exploded. He tore the documents apart, accusing her of spying and pretending to be a submissive wife. Flight attendants hurriedly closed the curtain. Yonan shouted that her only duty was to give birth to an heir. He ordered his secretary to arrange separate accommodations and to watch her closely. Sitting back down, he smiled coldly, deciding he could now freely contact another woman. Elsewhere, Di-jun sat across from his father and explained the real value of the hospital and development center. Sonan Hospital served VIP clients, politicians, and officials who valued secrecy. From now on, anyone seeking favors would need his father's approval. The development center would become mandatory for promotions. Yoongi slowly realized that human resources across industries would pass through his hands. Smiling, the main character calmly confirmed that both inside the company and outside it, his grandfather wanted people to see his son as the hallmark of everything he built. Looking kindly at the boy, Yoongi pushed back and said that this should have been his own distinguishing feature, then asked how the boy managed to understand his grandfather's intentions so clearly. Placing his hands on his knees, the boy replied that his father was simply never interested in these things, so he never knew. Pouting slightly, Yoongi asked whether he could find out the shareholder structure of the development center and all its branches, and if his son truly wanted to know what the real situation was. The man's lips dropped at the corners as he replied that this didn't seem like just a matter of building a personal network of connections, because if that were the case, there would be no reason to keep the transfer of companies a secret. Imagining the man's sharp gaze in his head, the boy said that maybe there was something his brothers wouldn't like. Rubbing his head, Yoongi muttered that there were simply too many secrets here. Smiling faintly, the main character replied that his grandfather had always been full of secrets. Leaning back against the sofa, the man asked why his son looked so much more like his grandfather than like him. Crossing his arms over his chest, he added that it felt awkward, but he needed to fulfill his duties as a father properly at least once. A peaceful smile appeared on his son's face. Outside, employees continued working despite unpaid wages, clinging to faint hope. Watching them, Di-jun asked about their fate. Sean replied that they should be saved with back pay and bonuses. The executive director of DI Construction introduced himself and extended his hand while everyone gathered around the table. The main character narrowed his eyes in disbelief because the director wasn't supposed to be here, only the butler. But the moment Fantasy Investment bought 5% of DI Construction, the main shareholder panicked and demanded an immediate meeting. The desk was stacked with folders and documents, making the situation painfully obvious. You don't ignore someone buying shares in a company on the edge of bankruptcy, especially when that someone is Fantasy Investment, the firm that swallowed the Inc. Group whole. Sean calmly introduced himself. In a deadlock like this, everyone was terrified for their position. Mugen forced a smile and said he was surprised investors had suddenly shown interest in their company. Watching closely, Jun couldn't tell if the director's expression showed curiosity or real fear. The director sat down and said their company wasn't attractive enough for an investor like Fantasy Investment and asked for the real reason behind the purchase. Sean replied without hesitation that investment companies only care about one thing: money. The director raised his eyebrows thoughtfully and asked if they had read the news at all, because investing in DI Construction was like jumping onto a sinking ship. Sean smiled when someone compared their stock to crushed tin cans. An old man with glasses added that it would be smarter to put the money in a bank instead. Sean's expression hardened. He turned to the old man and asked if his position was higher than the executive director. Then he snapped, reminding them that he owned 5% of the company and wasn't even talking to the CEO, just an executive director, so how dare this man interrupt? The old man froze and swallowed nervously while the younger employee stayed silent. The executive director stood up and apologized, explaining that management was desperately trying to find funds to save the company. He admitted that was why they wanted the investors to meet the trustee instead. The old man immediately bowed and begged forgiveness. Sean crossed his arms and said they could leave since he wanted a quieter conversation. The employees stared in shock but obeyed and left the office. Once alone, the director asked why Fantasy Investments suddenly bought their shares. Sean frowned and asked first why the director wanted this meeting. The main character had never seen his partner act like this, because Sean was usually polite, even joking around, but now he was aggressive. Jun quietly suggested that Sean believed the management was stealing money. Mugen admitted that was exactly why he wanted to meet, because it seemed the investors wanted something from them. He asked Sean to state his intentions directly. Sean replied coldly that he wanted to make money. The director explained that profit only came from selling shares at a higher price, which was impossible right now. Sean thought for a moment, then said someone would definitely buy those shares at a great price. The director laughed weakly and said many people still believed in DI Construction's revival. Hearing that, Sean smiled and said coming here was worth it because the right person would appear very soon. Satisfied, Mugen decided to do everything possible to delay things until their plans were complete, and offered a handshake. Then Sean casually mentioned they would meet again tomorrow. The director panicked and said that would be difficult. Sean calmly replied that he would demand an extraordinary shareholders meeting the day after tomorrow, so they better hurry. The director was left alone, stunned. Outside, as they reached the car, Sean adjusted his tie and muttered that these people were way too confident. The main character suggested launching an attack the next day and auditing all of DI Construction's assets the moment they gained access. Sean laughed and asked where he learned to move so fast. Jun replied that he was still far from his partner's level. Sean immediately called his team, ordering all appraisers, accountants from Saying Accounting, and investigators to be ready. The meeting would begin in 10 minutes. The car drove past towering buildings under a clear blue sky. Moments later, Yao leaned back in his chair and casually asked what happened and why the boy had rushed in like the building was already on fire. June didn't waste time. He said he needed help. That immediately amused the old man. He crossed his arms, smiled like a satisfied cat, and told him to explain everything. He promised to listen carefully and then decide how much profit he could squeeze out of the situation, because of course he would. June smiled back, already used to this. His grandfather had always been generous, but every conversation eventually boiled down to money. Looking down, June said this was about DI Construction, the company required to start the SMC project in MAFO this year. Yao closed his eyes, clearly done with warm-ups, and told him to skip the introductions and get straight to the point. June narrowed his eyes, picturing a collapsing building, and explained that the owners and management were draining the last drops from an already bankrupt company. Before that happened, he wanted to strike first and take over management. He asked for his grandfather's opinion, and he burst out laughing, loud and genuine. June relaxed instantly. If his grandfather was laughing, it meant everything was already under control. Scratching his chin, Yao asked who was running DI Construction. June replied that the general director was Muon and the executive director was his younger brother. Still seated, Yao asked whether June had met the executive director. June said they had met recently. Yao smirked and asked if June had confirmed they were stealing money. June answered seriously that the company's own employees contacted him after Fantasy Investment bought 5% of DI Construction shares, and even said management wanted to buy those shares back. Yao frowned in surprise. Buying back 5% was insane. He muttered that the stock market was full of hyenas who tore companies apart for profit and guessed this stunt was Sean's idea. June confirmed it. When Gyudon Construction collapsed, DI Construction shares also started falling, fueled by bankruptcy rumors. That made it easy to scoop up shares cheap. Money practically rained from the sky for bitter executives clinging to a sinking ship. In a stable company, 5% makes you a major shareholder, but the cost is massive, so even predators hesitate. Yao rested his chin on his hand and asked if the company panicked enough that they would move if June demanded an extraordinary shareholders' meeting. June answered calmly that instead of a meeting, he would demand access to the accounting books to find evidence of embezzlement. Yao looked at him sharply and asked if he planned to send them to prison. June confirmed it. The stolen assets had to be returned to clean the company and restart properly. His resolve was obvious. Standing before his grandfather's desk, June watched Yao think. The old man guessed that Muan's relatives probably held many shares that would need to be seized to secure management rights. June explained that if the stolen funds or goods were returned through shares owned by the director's relatives, the amount needed to gain control would drop significantly. Yao smiled and pointed out that company-owned shares aren't controlled by the director. June confirmed it. Yao stroked his chin again and said June still had a long road ahead, but there was no time. The takeover and stabilization of Dai Construction had to be finished before June, then they could move on to the MAFO project. June frowned slightly and said that was exactly why he came, to ask his grandfather to buy them time. Yao's eyes widened in disbelief. He stared at June and said time was too valuable to be bought with money. He crossed his arms, clearly unhappy. June replied that money couldn't buy an extra year of life, but it could buy dignity. Then he asked if salaries weren't money used to buy the lives of hundreds of thousands of employees. That made Yao raise his eyebrows. He closed his eyes, sighed, and said his grandson never failed to worry his heart. He then said the first step was banning Muan and his relatives from leaving the country. They had likely already transferred stolen funds abroad, so the Ministry of Justice needed to investigate. June smiled, satisfied. He stepped behind his grandfather and placed his hands on his shoulders, asking him to help with the travel ban. Yao picked up the phone and casually asked if Attorney General Kim was busy. June's eyes widened in shock. His grandfather knew the Prosecutor General personally. While June massaged his shoulders, Yao said it would be unforgivable to let people who looted a collapsing company flee the country. He asked the prosecutor to issue an immediate travel ban. Yao promised to report everything and even invited him over to eat and play later. After hanging up, Yao turned and asked if June was satisfied. June thanked him sincerely. Yao crossed his arms again and said the next step was finding at least one solid piece of evidence in the accounting reports, suing management for embezzlement, and letting pressure from the tax service and prosecutors crush them. June froze, confused by the word surrender. The office lights glowed brightly as Yao called him closer and asked what the true goal of acquiring Dai Construction was. June answered that it was to successfully launch the SMC project this year. Yao closed his eyes and told him to focus only on that and think about the rest later. June slowly understood. Focus on the immediate objective, not long-term fantasies. Yao continued. If June wanted to work with his uncle after the June elections, Dai Construction needed to be stabilized within 6 months. June nodded, imagining executives carrying boxes out of the building. Yao then asked what would happen if prosecutors opened a full investigation and launched a trial for embezzlement. June realized it would take years. During that time, the company would be torn apart by creditors. Yao concluded calmly that in that case, the company would fall into June's hands in 2 years at best. Time was the real enemy. June came to save time, and his grandfather gave him the answer. June realized surrender didn't mean defeat. He asked what preparing the path for salvation really meant. Yao smiled and explained that investigations should be used only as intimidation. Management must be given a choice. Prison and poverty in 2 years, or sell everything now, keep some money and escape abroad. June's eyes widened. Sweat ran down his face. This level of control was terrifying. This was only possible if his grandfather could start and stop investigations at will. Even throwing away tens of trillions wouldn't buy that power. Time had filled the gap money couldn't. Yao had paid officials for years. They sold their conscience, and in return, he owned their weakness. That weakness became the strength of the Sayang group. June squeezed his grandfather's shoulder, his expression tense. He finally understood how naive he'd been about buying time. Yao closed his eyes peacefully. June asked what would happen if the company surrendered, but Yao kept pressuring prosecutors. Yao replied that it depended on June. June bowed and thanked him. Yao replied that gratitude couldn't be put in a pocket. June said he was ready to hear his request. Yao's expression turned serious. He asked June to place Sayang group people into vacant management positions once Dai Construction was fully taken over. June froze, imagining the implications. If Sayang's people filled every role, including CEO, whose company would Dai Construction really be? Without turning, Yao said June had no people of his own. June argued that many from Gyudong Construction had left, and department heads at Dai Construction wanted promotions. It was a chance to refresh leadership. Yao widened his eyes and asked if June had thought this through. June asked if his grandfather would mind him considering it. Yao crossed his arms and said he didn't like that idea. He explained that construction leaders must rise from job sites. Men who could handle workers, survive sandstorms, demolish houses, evict residents, drink with laborers at lunch, yet stay sober enough to lead. June chuckled nervously. He knew construction leaders were rough, but he thought policies changed at the top. Clenching his fist, he wondered if he'd misunderstood everything. Yao smirked and asked if June thought he was offering poison when it was actually medicine. He narrowed his eyes and asked if June feared that Sayang Group would eventually take over a company filled with its own people. June stayed silent, hiding his fear. Yao stared him down, then smiled when June repeated that Dai Construction would be taken over by Sayang Group. Yao asked calmly if a man as greedy as him would simply hand over such a company. June stood there tense, lost in thought. Curious what happens next? Tap that cheeky bell, subscribe, like, and share.